The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace as Catherine walked slowly through the familiar halls. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floors, each step carrying the weight of 23 years of memories. The palace staff moved around her with gentle respect, their usual cheerful greetings replaced by understanding nods and warm, sympathetic smiles. Catherine had always found comfort in these walls. From the early days when she first entered as Prince William's girlfriend, nervous and excited about what the future might hold, to becoming the Duchess of Cambridge, and later the Princess of Wales. Every corner held a story, every room a chapter of their life together. She paused at the large windows overlooking the gardens where their children had played countless times. George, Charlotte, and Louis had filled these spaces with laughter and joy. She could almost hear their voices calling out as they chased each other around the fountain, William's deep laughter mixing with her own as they watched their children grow. The decision had not come easily. For months they had talked quietly in their private moments, away from the cameras and the constant attention. The weight of duty had always been heavy on William's shoulders, but lately, something had changed. The spark in his eyes had dimmed, and Catherine had noticed the way he would stare out at the horizon during their morning walks, as if searching for something he had lost. "The children need stability," William had said one evening as they sat together in their private sitting room. "But more than that, they need parents who are truly present, not just going through the motions of royal duties." Catherine had nodded, understanding completely. She had watched her husband struggle with the balance between being a father and fulfilling his role as the future king. The constant scrutiny, the endless engagements, and the pressure to always be perfect had taken its toll on their family life. Their conversations had stretched late into many nights. They talked about what truly mattered to them, about the kind of legacy they wanted to leave for their children, and about the possibility of a different kind of life, not abandoning their responsibilities entirely, but finding a way to serve that felt more authentic to who they had become as people and as parents. The palace staff had been the first to notice the subtle changes: fewer formal events, more family time, and a quiet sadness that seemed to follow the couple despite their public smiles. The senior courtiers had sensed something significant was coming, though none dared to ask directly. Catherine remembered the morning when William had finally made the call to his father. She had sat beside him, holding his hand as he explained their decision with a voice that cracked with emotion. The conversation had been difficult, filled with long pauses and careful words, but in the end, there had been understanding and even a quiet kind of relief from King Charles. Now, as she prepared for what would be their final weeks in this official capacity, Catherine felt a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for the end of an era, for disappointing those who had believed in them, and for leaving behind a role that had defined so much of their adult lives. But hope, too, for the possibility of rediscovering themselves away from the constant glare of public attention. She thought about the statement they would release together, carefully crafted to explain their decision without causing unnecessary alarm or speculation. It would speak of their deep gratitude for the support they had received, their continuing love for their country, and their desire to serve in a different capacity while prioritizing their family's well-being. The irony was not lost on her that in choosing to step back, they were perhaps making the most courageous decision of their public lives. It would not be understood by everyone, and they knew the criticism would come. But for the first time in years, Catherine felt they were being true to themselves and to their children. As evening approached, she made her way to the nursery where their youngest, Louis, was playing quietly with his toys. His innocent laughter filled the room, and Catherine realized that this sound, this simple joy, was what they were fighting to protect. Not just for Louis, but for George and Charlotte, too, who deserved to have parents who were present and happy, not just dutiful and proper. William found her there an hour later, and together they watched their son play, both understanding that they were on the brink of the biggest change their family had ever faced, but also knowing it was the right choice for all of them. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, sending shockwaves through the United Kingdom and around the world. The carefully worded statement from Kensington Palace was brief but clear. Their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales, would be stepping back from their official royal duties to focus on their family and explore new ways to serve their communities. Within minutes, news channels across the globe interrupted their regular programming, Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock and disbelief to understanding and support. The hashtag William and Kate began trending worldwide as millions of people tried to process what this meant for the royal family and for the couple they had watched grow up in the public eye. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles issued his own statement shortly after, expressing his understanding and support for his son and daughter-in-law's decision. "While we will miss their official presence," the statement read, "we respect their choice to prioritize their family's well-being and look forward to supporting them in whatever path they choose to take." The reaction from the British public was immediate and intense. Outside Kensington Palace, crowds began to gather, many holding flowers and handmade signs expressing their love and support. Others came simply to be part of this historic moment, to witness the end of an era that had begun with such hope and promise when William and Catherine had married in 2011. Mary Thompson, a 67-year-old retired teacher from Leeds, had traveled down to London as soon as she heard the news. Standing with tears in her eyes outside the palace gates, she spoke to anyone who would listen. "They've given us so much over the years," she said, clutching a small bouquet of daisies. "If they need to step away to be happy, then we should support them. Their parents first, royals second." Inside the palace, William and Catherine were experiencing a whirlwind of emotions. The relief of finally making their decision public was mixed with anxiety about the future and sadness about disappointing people who had supported them for so long. They had spent hours on the phone with family members, close friends, and senior staff members, explaining their reasoning and trying to ease concerns about what this meant for the monarchy. The children had been told the night before, in age-appropriate ways that helped them understand this was a positive change for their family. George, now old enough to grasp the significance, had asked thoughtful questions about what it meant for his future. Charlotte had been more concerned about whether they would still live in the same house and see their friends. Louis, still young, had simply been happy to hear he would get to spend more time with his parents. The media response was predictably intense. Royal correspondents who had covered the couple for years found themselves having to explain a situation none of them had truly anticipated. Some criticized the decision as selfish and irresponsible, arguing that royal duty should come before personal happiness. Others praised their courage in choosing family over obligation, calling it a modernization of an ancient institution. Television debates raged throughout the day, with royal experts, constitutional scholars, and ordinary citizens weighing in on what this decision meant for the future of the monarchy. Many drew comparisons to previous royal controversies, but others argued that this was entirely different because it was not driven by scandal or conflict, but by a genuine desire to be better parents and find a more sustainable way of life. International reaction was equally mixed, but generally more supportive. Presidents and prime ministers from around the world issued statements expressing their respect for the couple's decision and their continued friendship with the United Kingdom. Many people outside Britain saw it as a refreshingly honest choice that put human values before institutional expectations. Catherine found herself thinking about all the young mothers who had written to her over the years, sharing their struggles with balancing work and family life. In stepping back, she hoped she might be showing them that it was okay to make difficult choices for the sake of their children's well-being, even when those choices came with sacrifice and criticism. As the day wore on, more details emerged about their plans. They would complete their scheduled engagements through the end of the month, giving them time to say proper goodbyes to the charities and organizations they had supported. They would retain their titles but would not carry out official royal duties or receive public funding for their activities. The evening news featured interviews with people from all walks of life, sharing their thoughts on the announcement. A young father from Manchester said he admired their courage. An elderly woman from Scotland worried about what it meant for tradition. A teenage girl from Wales said she thought it was romantic that they were choosing love and family over everything else. William and Catherine watched some of the coverage together that evening, holding hands as they saw the faces of people whose lives they had touched over the years. It was overwhelming to realize how many people cared about their decision and how their choice to prioritize their family had resonated with so many others who faced similar struggles between duty and personal happiness. The weeks that followed the announcement were filled with a constant stream of visitors, phone calls, and emotions that ranged from heartbreaking to heartwarming. Catherine had underestimated how many people would want to say goodbye personally and the steady flow of friends, staff members, and representatives from the hundreds of charities they had supported over the years was both touching and exhausting. One of the most difficult conversations came when Sarah, the head of a children's mental health charity that Catherine had championed for 8 years, broke down in tears during what was supposed to be a routine meeting. "You've been our voice," Sarah said, her hands shaking as she held her teacup. "When you spoke about children's mental health, the whole world listened. We're terrified about what happens now." Catherine had to excuse herself to compose her emotions. She stepped into the quiet of the palace garden, where she had so often found peace during challenging times. The weight of responsibility she was laying down felt heavier in moments like these than it ever had when she was carrying it. She knew that stepping back was the right choice for her family, but seeing the real impact on people and causes she cared deeply about made the decision no less painful. William was experiencing his own difficult goodbyes. The military units he had served with, the Air Rescue Service where he had found some of his most meaningful work, the environmental organizations he had supported, each farewell carried its own weight. During a private dinner with some of his closest military colleagues, one of them raised a toast to the best helicopter pilot we ever had the privilege to serve with, and to the man who never forgot where he came from. The children were handling the transition in their own ways. George had become quieter, more thoughtful, often found reading in corners of the palace or asking his parents careful questions about what their new life would look like. Charlotte seemed to understand that something important was happening but was more focused on practical matters, like whether she would still be able to ride her horse and see her friends from school. Louis, at his young age, was simply happy to have his parents around more often. He had started following Catherine around the palace, holding her hand and chattering about his toys and his day. In his innocent way, he was already experiencing the benefit of their decision. More present, less stressed parents who had time to really listen to his stories. The staff at Kensington Palace were struggling with their own emotions. Many of them had worked for the couple since the early days of their marriage and had watched the family grow. Mrs. Henderson, who had been Catherine's personal assistant for 12 years, admitted that she felt like she was losing a daughter and grandchildren. "I know it's not my place to say," she told Catherine during one of their final working sessions, "but I want you to know that I think you're incredibly brave. Not many people would give up what you're giving up for their children." The public response continued to evolve as people had time to process the news. Polling showed that while initial reactions were mixed, support for the couple's decision was growing, particularly among parents and younger people. Many families shared their own stories of difficult choices between career and family, creating a national conversation about work-life balance and what really mattered in life. Letters poured in from around the world. Teachers wrote about how Catherine's visits to their schools had inspired their students. Military families shared how William's service and advocacy had helped them through difficult times. Cancer patients described how Catherine's hospital visits had given them hope during their treatments. Each letter was a reminder of the impact they had made and the people they would no longer be able to help in the same way. One letter that particularly moved Catherine came from a 9-year-old girl named Emma, who had met her during a visit to a children's hospital 2 years earlier. Emma wrote in careful handwriting, "Dear Princess Catherine, my mummy says you won't be doing princess work anymore so you can take better care of your children. I think that's really nice because my mummy had to stop working when I was sick so she could take care of me too. I hope your children know how lucky they are." The practical aspects of stepping back were more complicated than either William or Catherine had anticipated. There were legal considerations about their titles, financial arrangements to be made, security details to be worked out, and decisions about which personal relationships they could maintain with various organizations. Each detail required careful negotiation and planning. Most importantly, they were trying to decide where to live and how to structure their new life. They had always loved Anmer Hall, their country home in Norfolk, where they had experienced some of their happiest family moments away from the public eye. The idea of making it their primary residence, of waking up each morning to the sound of birds instead of London traffic, of letting the children run freely in the countryside, was becoming more appealing each day. During a quiet evening walk around the Kensington Palace gardens, Catherine found herself memorizing details she had never paid attention to before. The way the light fell on the fountain at sunset, the sound of her footsteps on the gravel paths, The feeling of being surrounded by history and tradition that she was about to leave behind. It was a bittersweet meditation on endings and new beginnings, on the life she had known and the life she was choosing to create. The decision of where to build their new life had been weighing heavily on both William and Catherine's minds. After weeks of quiet discussions and several private visits to look at options, they had settled on a decision that surprised even some of their closest friends and family members. Rather than retreating to one of the traditional royal residences, they had chosen to purchase a modest farmhouse in the Cotswolds, far from the bustling energy of London and the constant attention that followed them everywhere. The house itself was nothing like the palaces they had called home for so many years. Built of honey-colored stone with a slate roof that had weathered decades of English rain, it sat on 30 acres of rolling countryside with ancient oak trees and a small stream that wound through the property. When Catherine first walked through the front door, she felt something she had not experienced in years: complete privacy and peace. "The children can actually be children here," William had said as they stood in what would become their new kitchen, looking out at fields where George, Charlotte, and Louis could run and explore without bodyguards trailing behind them or photographers hiding in the bushes. The security arrangements would still be necessary, but they could be far more discreet in this setting. The process of choosing this new life had brought William and Catherine closer together than they had been in years. Away from the constant demands of royal duties, they were rediscovering the couple they had been when they first fell in love at university. They spent hours walking through the countryside near their new home, talking about their dreams for the future and making plans that had nothing to do with official engagements or state dinners. Their decision to leave London was not just about finding peace for themselves. It was about giving their children a chance to grow up with a sense of normalcy that would be impossible in the fishbowl environment of royal life. George, who would soon be starting secondary school, had been the most affected by the constant attention and pressure that came with his position in the line of succession. In their new home, he could walk to the village school without a security detail, play football with local children, and develop friendships based on who he was as a person rather than his title. Charlotte had always been the most adaptable of their children, but even she had begun asking difficult questions about why she could not have friends over for sleepovers like other children her age. The new house had plenty of room for children to visit and play, and Catherine was looking forward to the sound of young voices filling their home without the formality and protocol that had governed their previous family life. Louis, still so young and full of energy, would benefit most of all from having acres of safe space to explore. Catherine had already envisioned him building tree houses, learning to fish in the stream, and helping William tend to the vegetable garden they planned to establish. These were the kinds of childhood experiences that had been impossible in their previous life, where every outdoor activity required advanced planning and security sweeps. The transition was not without its emotional challenges. Catherine found herself grieving for the work she was leaving behind, particularly her advocacy for early childhood development and mental health. She had spent years building relationships with researchers, practitioners, and families affected by these issues, and stepping away felt like abandoning people who needed support and attention. William was struggling with his own sense of loss, particularly around his environmental work and his role with organizations supporting military veterans. These causes had given him a sense of purpose beyond his royal duties, and he worried about whether he could continue to make a meaningful impact without the platform and resources that came with his official role. However, they were both discovering that stepping back from official duties did not mean stepping away from service entirely. They were exploring ways to support causes they cared about through private philanthropy and direct involvement that would be less visible, but potentially more meaningful. William had already begun conversations with environmental groups about consulting work he could do without the publicity and protocol of official royal involvement. Catherine was considering returning to school to study child psychology, something she had always been interested in but had never had time to pursue. The idea of being a student again, of learning and growing in a structured way, was both terrifying and exciting after so many years of being defined by her public role. The children were handling the changes better than either parent had expected. George had asked thoughtful questions about what this meant for his future responsibilities, and seemed relieved when William explained that this was about choosing when and how to serve, not abandoning duty entirely. Charlotte was most excited about the animals they would be able to have at their new home: horses, dogs, and maybe even chickens. Louis was simply happy about the promise of a treehouse and a swing that would hang from the old oak tree in their garden. As they prepared for the final weeks of their official duties, both William and Catherine felt a sense of anticipation that had been missing from their lives for years. They were not just ending one chapter of their story, they were actively choosing to write a new one, with their family's happiness and well-being as the central theme. The weight of tradition and expectation that had pressed down on them for so long was slowly lifting, replaced by the lighter but no less significant responsibility of being present, engaged parents who could give their children the gift of a normal childhood, and the security of knowing they were their parents' first priority. The day of their final official engagement arrived with an unusual mix of autumn sunshine and scattered clouds, as if the weather itself could not decide whether this was a day for celebration or mourning. Catherine stood before her wardrobe in the early morning light, choosing what would be her last outfit as a working member of the royal family. She selected a deep blue dress that had always been one of William's favorites, paired with the pearl earrings that had belonged to Diana, a subtle nod to the past while stepping into an uncertain future. The engagement was a visit to a children's hospital in Birmingham, the same hospital where Catherine had made one of her first official visits as the Duchess of Cambridge, more than a decade earlier. The symmetry was not lost on her as she and William made the drive north, their hands clasped together in the backseat of the car, both lost in their own thoughts about what this day would mean. When they arrived at the hospital, the crowds were larger than usual. Word had spread that this would be their final official appearance, and people had traveled from across the country to be part of this moment. Children held handmade signs with messages of love and support, while parents lifted toddlers onto their shoulders to catch a glimpse of the couple who had become such a familiar and comforting presence in British life. Inside the hospital, Catherine found herself moving more slowly than usual, wanting to savor each interaction. She spent extra time with 7-year-old Sophie, who was recovering from surgery and had drawn a picture of the princess with her 3 children. "Will you still be a princess even if you don't do princess work anymore?" Sophie asked with the direct honesty that only children possess. Catherine knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her voice gentle but clear. "I'll always be a princess, sweetheart, but more importantly, I'll always be a mummy first. Just like your mummy is the most important person in your life, my children need me to be the most important person in theirs right now." William was having his own meaningful conversations in the pediatric ward, where he met with teenage patients who were dealing with serious illnesses. One 16-year-old boy named James, who had been following William's environmental work, asked if he would continue fighting climate change even after stepping back from royal duties. "The planet doesn't care about titles," William replied, sitting on the edge of James's bed. "The work that matters, protecting the environment, supporting people who need help, being there for our families, that work doesn't stop just because we're changing how we do it. If anything, I hope I can do it better now, without all the formality and protocol getting in the way." The hospital staff had prepared a small reception for their visit, and as William and Catherine moved through the room, they were struck by how many of the doctors and nurses shared personal stories about how their visits over the years had impacted the hospital community. Dr. Sarah Chen, the head of pediatric oncology, spoke about how Catherine's advocacy for children's mental health had helped secure funding for new support programs that had made a real difference in young patients' recovery experiences. "You may think, you're stepping away," Dr. Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. "But the work you've done, the attention you've brought to these issues, that legacy will continue long after today." The final part of their visit was the most emotional. They had requested a private moment in the hospital's memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to children who had lost their battles with illness. As they stood together among the flowering trees and memorial stones, both Catherine and William were overwhelmed by memories of all the brave children they had met over the years, the families they had tried to comfort, and the privilege they had been given to be part of these most sacred and difficult moments in people's lives. "We've been so lucky," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face, "to be trusted with these stories, to be let into these families' lives during their hardest times. How do we walk away from that?" William put his arm around her, his own eyes wet with tears. "We're not walking away," he said quietly. We're just changing how we show up. Maybe now we can be even more present, even more real, because we won't be worried about protocol or saying the right thing for the cameras." As they prepared to leave the hospital, the staff and families had gathered in the main corridor to say goodbye. There were no formal speeches or ceremony, just heartfelt thanks and warm embraces. Catherine hugged each member of the nursing staff, many of whom she had worked with for years. William shook hands with the security guards and maintenance workers, people who were often invisible during official visits but who had always been part of making these encounters meaningful. The drive back to London was quiet, both of them processing the emotions of the day. They had done hundreds of engagements over the years, but this one felt different, more personal, more real, more connected to the reasons they had wanted to serve in the first place. When they returned to Kensington Palace that evening, they found their children waiting for them with a surprise. George, Charlotte, and Louis had worked with their nanny to prepare a special dinner in the family's private dining room. The table was set with handmade place cards and drawings, and Louis had picked flowers from the palace garden to create a centerpiece. "We wanted to celebrate," George explained, suddenly seeming much older than his years. "Not because you're stopping your royal work, but because you're starting your parent work full-time." As they sat around the table that night, sharing stories about their day and making plans for their new life in the countryside, Catherine realized that this was what they had been searching for all along. Not the absence of purpose or responsibility, but the presence of choice about how to love and serve the people who mattered most to them. The moving day arrived on a crisp October morning, with golden leaves swirling around the removal trucks that had been carefully positioned outside Kensington Palace before dawn. Catherine stood in what had been their bedroom for the last time, looking around at the empty walls where family photographs had hung, and the bare surfaces where her jewelry box and William's reading books had once lived. The room looked impossibly large and impersonal without their belongings, nothing like the warm, private sanctuary it had been for their family. The children had spent the previous evening saying goodbye to their rooms, each processing the move in their own way. Charlotte had carefully packed her favorite stuffed animals and books, making sure each one was safely wrapped for the journey. She had also written a thank you note to the palace, which she left on her windowsill for the staff to find. George had been more methodical, organizing his belongings with the precision of someone much older. But Catherine had found him the night before sitting quietly in his empty room, just thinking. Louis, too young to fully understand the permanence of the move, had treated it like an adventure. He had run through the empty corridors that morning, his footsteps echoing in a way they never had when the rooms were full of furniture and life. His laughter provided a welcome lightness to what was otherwise a deeply emotional day for everyone involved. The palace staff had gathered in the courtyard to say their final goodbyes. These were people who had been part of their daily lives for years. Mrs. Henderson, who had managed Catherine's schedule and become a trusted confidant. James, the security guard who had taught George how to tie his shoes. Maria, the housekeeper who had comforted Charlotte after nightmares and celebrated Louis's first steps. Each goodbye was a small heartbreak, the ending of relationships that had gone far beyond the professional. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a memory book filled with photographs and notes from their years together, including pictures from private family moments that the public had never seen. "You've been more than employers," she said, her voice shaking as she presented the book to Catherine. "You've been family, and families don't really say goodbye, they just say see you later." William had spent extra time with the ground staff, the men and women who had maintained the gardens where his children had played and learned to love nature. He had often joined them for early morning work in the gardens, finding peace in the simple act of planting and tending to growing things. Thomas, the head gardener, had prepared a small sapling from one of the palace's ancient oak trees, carefully potted so they could plant it at their new home. "Every great tree starts small," Thomas said as he handed William the sapling. "This one carries a bit of this place with it, but it'll grow into something entirely its own in new soil." The drive to their new home in the Cotswolds took 3 hours, with the children alternating between excitement about their new adventure and sadness about leaving the only home they had really known. They stopped for lunch at a small pub along the way, where other customers recognized them but respectfully gave them space to eat as a family without interruption. It was a small preview of the kind of life they hoped to have, still public figures, but ones who could move through the world with a bit more normalcy and privacy. When they finally arrived at their new home, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the property. The house looked even more welcoming than Catherine remembered, with smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. The previous owners had left a bottle of wine and a welcome note, along with fresh flowers in every room and a tea tray set up in the kitchen. The children immediately ran outside to explore the property, their voices carrying across the fields as they discovered the stream, the old barn, and the massive oak tree that would soon hold their promised treehouse. Catherine and William stood on the front porch, watching their children experience true freedom for perhaps the first time in their lives, and felt a sense of rightness that they had not experienced in years. The first night in their new home was both magical and overwhelming. They had dinner by candlelight in the kitchen, sitting around a simple wooden table that was nothing like the formal dining arrangements they were used to. Louis kept jumping up to look out the windows at the stars, which were more visible here than they had ever been in London. Charlotte wanted to sleep with her window open so she could hear the owls that lived in the nearby woods. George helped William build a fire in the sitting room fireplace, learning skills he had never needed in the palace. As they settled the children into their new bedrooms, each one decorated with familiar belongings but feeling completely different in this new setting, Catherine realized that they were not just changing where they lived, they were changing how they lived. The pace was slower, the atmosphere was calmer, and for the first time in years, they felt like they could breathe fully. Late that night, after the children were asleep, William and Catherine walked hand in hand around their property, under a canopy of stars that had been invisible from their London home. They talked quietly about their hopes and fears for this new chapter, about the work they still wanted to do in the world, and about the kind of parents they wanted to be, now that they had the freedom to make those choices without the weight of institutional expectation. "Do you think we'll miss it?" Catherine asked as they stood by the stream, listening to the gentle sound of water moving over rocks. William was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think we'll miss parts of it," he said honestly. "The sense of purpose, the ability to help people on a large scale, the feeling that we were making a difference. But I don't think we'll miss the pressure, the constant scrutiny, or the feeling that we were never quite ourselves." They stood together in the darkness, holding each other and listening to the sounds of their new life, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of night birds, and the profound quiet that comes from being far away from the noise and demands of the world they had known. 6 months after their quiet goodbye to royal life, Catherine stood in her vegetable garden on a warm spring morning, dirt under her fingernails and the sun warming her face. She could hear the sound of laughter coming from the field behind their house, where William was teaching the children how to fly the kite they had made together the previous weekend. It was the kind of ordinary, perfect moment that would have been impossible in their former life, and she found herself smiling as she tended to the tomato plants that Louis had helped her start from seeds. The transition had not been without its challenges. There had been difficult days when Catherine wondered if they had made the right choice, particularly when she saw news coverage of causes she cared about struggling without the attention her patronage had brought. William had struggled with feeling disconnected from the work he had been passionate about, and both of them had needed time to adjust to a life that was no longer structured around official engagements and public appearances. But the rewards had far outweighed the difficulties. George had blossomed in his new school, where he was known simply as George Wales and was judged on his character and achievements rather than his title. He had joined the school's environmental club and was working on a project about sustainable farming practices, something that would have been nearly impossible to pursue seriously while living in the public eye. His teachers described him as thoughtful, kind, and surprisingly normal for someone with his background. Charlotte had developed a love for horseback riding and spent most afternoons at the local stables, where she was learning not just to ride but to care for the animals. She had made close friendships with other children in the village, and Catherine often found their house full of young voices and the chaos of childhood that had been missing from their palace life. The sight of Charlotte playing freely with her friends without security concerns or protocol considerations was worth every sacrifice they had made. Louis was thriving in ways that amazed both his parents. The shy, sometimes anxious little boy who had struggled with the constant attention and formal atmosphere of royal life had transformed into a confident, curious child who spent his days exploring the countryside, building forts, and asking endless questions about everything from why birds could fly to how clouds were made. He had started at the village primary school and was learning to read while sitting under the oak tree in their garden. William had found a new sense of purpose through his work with a small environmental consulting firm that operated quietly and effectively without media attention. He was able to use his knowledge and connections to support conservation projects around the world, but without the ceremonial aspects and public scrutiny that had often overshadowed the actual work. He came home each evening energized rather than drained, excited to share with Catherine the real progress he was making on issues he cared deeply about. Catherine had enrolled in a distance learning program to study child psychology, something she had always wanted to pursue but had never had time for during her royal duties. She studied in the early mornings before the children woke up, and in the evenings after they went to bed, rediscovering the joy of learning for its own sake. Her studies were already informing volunteer work she was doing with local families, providing support and resources without the fanfare and media coverage that had accompanied her previous charitable work. The family had developed new traditions that reflected their changed priorities. Sunday mornings were spent hiking in the nearby hills, with the children competing to spot different birds and wildflowers, while William and Catherine talked about their week and made plans for the future. They had family game nights, cooked dinner together most evenings, and read stories aloud by the fireplace on winter nights, simple pleasures that had been rare luxuries in their former life. The public had largely respected their decision to step back, and when they were occasionally recognized during trips to the village or nearby towns, people were generally kind and respectful of their privacy. The intense media scrutiny had faded as they had hoped, replaced by occasional respectful coverage of their new life that focused more on their choice to prioritize family than on criticism of their decision. King Charles had visited twice, and both times he had commented on how relaxed and happy his son and daughter-in-law seemed. "You found yourselves again?" he had told them during his most recent visit as he watched his grandchildren show him around their property with unbridled enthusiasm. "This is who you were meant to be." On this particular spring morning, as Catherine finished her gardening and walked toward the field where her family was playing, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The decision to step back from royal life had been the most difficult of their marriage, but it had also been the most important. They had traded the security and purpose of institutional life for the uncertainty and freedom of choosing their own path, and while the future was less predictable, it was also more authentically theirs. William looked up as she approached, his hair tousled by the wind and his face lit up with the kind of genuine happiness she had not seen in years. The children ran to her, eager to demonstrate how high they had managed to get their kite to fly, their faces flushed with exercise and joy. As she gathered them all into a hug, Catherine realized that in choosing to say goodbye to their royal roles, they had actually said hello to the life they had always wanted, one where love and family came first, where they could be present for the moments that mattered most, and where their children could grow up knowing they were their parents' highest priority. The quiet goodbye that had moved millions to tears had become the foundation for a quiet hello to a new kind of happiness, one measured not in public recognition or duty fulfilled, but in the daily choice to put family first and to find meaning in the simple, profound work of raising children who felt secure, loved, and free to become whoever they were meant to be.